Hello, welcome back. So now that we can map numbers to notes, let's talk about how we could create a looping sequence inside Tone.js. So I've remixed the previous example here and renamed it tone sequence. So this is where we left off. Just being able to map numbers to notes. So let's delete some code here. We're going to get rid of this representation, but we are going to keep our map note function that we created and also our modulo, little modulo function as well. Okay, so let's talk about creating a sequence in Tone.js. There's a lot of different ways we can do it. We're going to bring up here real quick the Tone.js documentation. If we look through the API, there's a few objects we can use for this purpose. So over here, so Tone has something called a loop, right? So loop is just basically going to trigger a function on a particular beat, on a particular scheduled time. Also has something called a sequence. So a sequence just kind of is going to walk through an array of notes and also on the beat on a particular given time. Now, what we're going to be using in today's example is an object called the pattern. So the pattern is going to be interesting because much like the sequence, it's going to allow us to go through an array of values. But on top of this, it's going to be able to, know a little bit about creating different arpeggiations, which means going through notes one at a time and following different directions. For example, we're going to be able to use the pattern object to cycle through the array, right, from start to finish. But then we can also pass it different values, like go back and forth through the array, right? Kind of up and down, creating different motions. And that's going to be useful in our next example when we turn our little simple sequence into a fully fledged musical composition. So the arpeggiator has different types of patterns here. So you have up and down, up, down, up, alternate up and down. That's going to alternate the notes. You can also walk through your pattern randomly, which can be kind of interesting. So that's going to give us lots of options to explore when we create our composition, final composition. So the pattern is the sort of the more advanced sequence that we have to our disposal in Tone.js. So we're going to use this this object. Let's go back to our code here. All right, so let's create an object here. We're going to call this our pattern. And pattern object is going to use an array to figure out which notes it's supposed to play. And we're going to call this array the sequence. Now, instead of putting in just note names here directly, like let's say we wanted to play a sequence of notes, we could put in note names directly and then work from there. For example, this sequence, right? Some kind of a C major chord. But here we have an array called scale, right? And we devised a way to map numbers to notes. So we're going to abstract our sequence here. We're going to think of it as numbers instead of notes. And what that's going to allow us to do down the road, it's going to make it a lot easier to manipulate the sequences because we're only going to be manipulating numbers or indices instead of having to worry about manipulating musical notes, which is kind of complicated. So what I mean by this is if I wanted to play that particular note sequence, right? And let's add another one. Let's say this simple 4-note sequence. We're going to map this to numbers instead. So bringing up my keyboard here, right? Instead of playing C4 as a note, we're going to say this is going to be 0 because this is the first note in our array, in our scale array. So this would be 0, 2, 4, 6. Which happens to form a C major 7 chord. So we're going to think of our sequence not in terms of notes, but in terms of note numbers. That's also going to have the added benefit that whatever our scale becomes, right? If we change from, say, a major to a minor tonality or come up with some other scale altogether, these note sequences are always going to be valid, right? Remember, they can exceed the number of notes in the scale. So one of those could be a negative number if we want to go to a lower pitch. One of those could be a high number if we want to jump to a really high pitch all of a sudden. So we're able to do that. So our sequence is just going to be an array of indices into our scale. All right, so let's create the sequence itself as a Tone.js object, or the pattern. So we're going to create the pattern object here. So this is the pattern, and the constructor takes a few parameters here. The first one is going to be a function, just like when we created a loop object in last week. It's going to be a function that's going to run every time the pattern is ready to trigger on the beat. And we're going to define the function here using an anonymous function on the fly. And the syntax for that is as follows, right? We're going to have parameters, and we'll name these in a second, going into a block of code. So this is a syntax in JavaScript we can use to define a function right as an argument here into, let's say, a constructor or even another function. Because in JavaScript, functions are just variables like everything else. So the pattern object, its callback function, the function that it will run whenever a beat is getting triggered, takes two parameters. The first one is the time, that's the scheduled time for that beat. And then the other parameter is going to be the index value, right, into the sequence that we're going to give it to iterate over. So we're going to write the code to that function in a second. The next parameter that we're going to pass to our pattern is going to be our sequence array we want to iterate over. And then the last parameter is going to be, optionally, we can put in a pattern type. Okay, so we're going to just move through our sequence in an upwards direction. This is the default, but we're going to put it in now, and we can try different different types of arpeggiated patterns if we want to. So let's write the callback function here. So time is going to be the time we want to schedule the node at, and then index is going to be the value we're getting from our sequence. And the pattern object is going to take care of cycling through these values for us. So just so we can see what's going on here, let's quickly just. Normally, it's not a good idea to draw inside these callbacks, but we're going to make a little exception here, just so we can see the index value and we can see what's going on. And we're going to draw this in the center. It's not really important what it looks like here. I just want to see the value so we can see how index is changing over time. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to also do pattern.start. That's going to start our pattern. And then we need to start the transport, which is the kind of the global play button, if you will, for Tone.js. Let's comment out this background so we can actually see the changes we are making. Okay, so text is a little bit small here. Let's make it bigger. So we can see what the pattern object is doing is cycling through this sequence we've given it. So it's going 0, 2, 4, 6. If I change the type of pattern, right, I could put in up, down, for example. Now we would get, it's going up and down, right? 0, 2, 4, 6, 4, 2, 0. So we can use that number, instead of drawing it here, we can use that number to play a note. So we're going to use our map note function here to allow us to do this. So we're going to say map note, the index, right? And we're going to use scale as the array we're mapping to. So that's our base scale, which is C4 major, and then we're going to map this index into the scale. Then we're going to let our synth play the note. So we'll say trigger, attack, release, note. Now we need to put in a note duration. So for now, we'll just put an 1/8 of a note. And then we're going to put in our time variable. What the time variable does here, we're getting it as a parameter. This is a scheduled time in the future. And this is going to ensure that our synth is always going to be playing on the beat. Let's put the background back. And then now that we've played a note, let's also make previous note equal to note. Remember, a previous note here is the global variable. Or actually, let's call it current note. That's the current note we've just played, right? That makes a little bit more sense. And then in draw, we're going to put the code back here to draw that note. Probably should just not have deleted the other code, but we'll just put that in again really quickly. Current note, we're going to center this into the window, just so we have something to look at. So this is playing our sequence of notes, right? We could add notes to this sequence. For example, if I add a 5th note and I go up to 7, right? Our map note function is going 1 octave higher to the C5. I could change the pattern, right? I could go up, down, for example. I might also want to change the speed at which this pattern is playing. And I can do this by setting pattern.interval. And that's going to be the interval between notes. By default, I think it's playing quarter notes. So if we set that interval to be, let's say, 8 notes, it's playing a lot quicker now. 1 note is like a full beat, a lot slower. We can go really fast with some 16th notes. And then there's lots of different sequences, right? There was the alternate up, for example. So this is alternating notes, but going up into the pattern. So this is something we can play with down the road. We're going to go back to just up here for a sequence. And we're going to go back to 4 notes. Now these notes, they can be rearranged. They don't have to be in the same order also, right? We could decide maybe this is our sequence. Slow it down. Okay. So you get the idea. So now we can create sequences, and what we've done is we've separated, right, the concept of note numbers from which notes we're actually playing. So our sequence now is really just a series of indices into this scale array. And those note numbers, right, they can be positive or they can also be negative. So now if I, let's say, want to go down into the scale, right, I can put in a negative number, and that's going to take me to the left of the first note in my scale. And we can put high numbers, and that jumps in octaves. Doesn't necessarily sound good, but we can do it. All right. Okay. Now, there's one little caveat here that's important to know about when we're working with the pattern object, and that is, I'm just going to put some, pause this here. So when we're working with the pattern object, once we've given the pattern object a sequence, if I go and modify this sequence, it's not going to affect the pattern object. And let me show you what I mean by that. If I play this sequence, and then we're going to add some code here. Let's say in key pressed, I'm going to make the sequence equal to something else entirely, right? Just the first 4 notes. So the sequence, I'm pressing a key, you can't see. The sequence is being changed, but the pattern is not changed. Okay? That's because the sequence we give to pattern gets cached in the constructor. And once we've set this particular sequence, if we go and transform this array here, our source array, it's not going to get affected in the pattern object itself. So here's a way that we can, actually I should have deleted that. Here's a way that we can work around this. So what we're going to do is, instead of passing here our sequence directly to the pattern, we're going to pass an array that contains just the index number of all of these these note numbers that we've put in, which really is going to be just an array that's going to have 0, 1, 2, 3 into it, right? A simple sequence going up. And this is the thing that we're going to receive, this index, into the array. We're going to add one level of indirection. That's the thing we're going to receive in our callback here. Is there's going to be the index into this sequence. And that's going to allow us to change the sequence, but not change how we're iterating over it, which is just going to be controlled by whatever pattern mode we've chosen. So let me demonstrate what I mean here. So first we need to create an array that's going to have the same number of elements as our sequence, and it's going to contain just the index values, right? So this is just going to be numbers going up by 1. So if we have a sequence that has 4 notes, we want this array to give to the pattern to be an array that has 0, 1, 2, and 3. If we have a sequence of 7 notes, right, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth. So there's many ways we could do this, but the easiest way that I could think of is to use the array object inside JavaScript, and then I'm going to show you how this works in a second. We're going to open the console just to demonstrate. So here I'm in my JavaScript console. So let's say I make an array here. We're going to call it A, and this array just has arbitrary values into it. Okay, so just an array with 3 elements. If I wanted to create an array of indices, I could use the array object, right? And we could create an array from a.keys. So what a.keys does, keys is what's called an iterator. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but the keys of an array in JavaScript are basically the indices, right? So we can have arrays that actually have other object as keys, right? We could have any kind of arbitrary key value mapping in JavaScript, whether it's strings to numbers or whatever. But the simple array has numbers to its content as the mapping, which means the key into the array is an index value. So if I use this code here, see, I'm going to get back an array that just contains the index values for whatever array I provided. Or if I make a equals to, I'm just putting in like random numbers here, something longer, right? And then I do that same idea again. I'm going to get an array that contains the index value, right, for each of these steps of the array. So we're going to borrow this thing and bring it into our code here. And rather than put in the sequence directly, we're going to get an array from sequence.keys. Get rid of the semicolon here, which means in our callback, now index is actually going to be an index into the sequence, right? So what we want to do is map a note here, sequence index. All right, so we're back where we started. The big difference is now if I go and mess with the sequence, right, with a key press, now the sequence is actually changed, right? So now it's just going up the 4 first notes of the scale. So in other words, what we've done is we've given us the ability to modify this sequence, which is going to come in handy for the next lesson by changing how our pattern is, what the pattern is iterating over. Instead of iterating over the sequence directly, we iterate over this second array that just contains the index of each of these positions. And we can still do, up, down, for example, or any other of the pattern features. The main difference is now it's very easy to modify our sequence on the fly while pattern is running. Okay. So having done all of this here, the next step in our little exploration today is going to be to think about, now that we have a little pattern, a little nugget of sound, we're going to create a full composition from this pattern by layering it with itself. We're going to transform the pattern. We're going to play a slowed down version on top of the original. And we're going to create a few layers that way that are going to result in some interesting combinations of notes, but also polyrhythms. Which means that we're going to want to create multiple copies of this simple pattern. So let's take the work we've done here in creating one pattern and abstract it into a class of objects. So we have an easy way into our next example to create multiple patterns, or we can think of them as multiple tracks of the same pattern. So let's take the code we have in this example so far and package it as a reusable class. So we're going to call this class a track. Just made this name up here. So a class in JavaScript has a constructor, and the constructor is going to take a certain number of parameters. We'll decide what those are in a second. And then it's also going to have some functions, and we'll put those in as needed. Okay, so what's going to define a track in our composition? It's going to be a few things, right? It's going to be a particular pattern object, right? The sequence, we're going to leave it as a global thing, because in the example we're doing today, we're going to play with this idea of taking one sequence, a single sequence, and then reusing it multiple times to create a composition. So the sequence is going to be a global object, but our track is going to be, a synth, a note currently being played. We're going to put that into the track object, and then a pattern object as well. So let's move these things into our track function. Now, when we define objects inside a class, inside a constructor, we're not going to use let. We're just going to say this. And that means we're using this keyword to define objects that are going to be properties of the track object. So we saw our synth here. This is how we declared it. So instead of doing this in initialize audio, we're going to do this in the constructor. And we'll say this.synth. I'm just copy and pasting here so I can save some typing. And this.synth to destination. And the idea behind doing this is that every track is going to have its own synth, so they can play different notes at different times. And we'll do the same thing with the pattern. So the pattern, we're going to say this.pattern. Okay. Actually, well, I'm going to let glitch format this for me. Okay. Now here we have to be a little bit careful because we want, not just the global synth object. We want to have this.synth be the object that's going to play a note, right? That's going to trigger. We want this.current note to update. The sequence remains a global object, so we're not going to add the this parameter to it. And then what else do we need to change here? Scale is global. That's fine for now. Okay. Pattern.start. All right. This defines a track now. We haven't yet put in anything in the constructor, but we'll come back to that once we make sure that this track object is working. So let's create a track just to test it. Now we're not going to define our track in setup, and the reason for that is because we are creating some audio object inside our track constructor. So instead we're going to create our track object in initialize audio, and we're going to say track equals new track. This is the class we just defined. All right, so that won't play. There's an error here. This.pattern, right? That should have been referring to our pattern object. Now we don't see the note being played anymore because current note, right? We've moved into this track object. So instead of current note in draw, we are going to say track.current note. So now we've created an object for our looping sequence, or we've called this idea a track. But the only downside to this track object is we don't really have any ways to customize it. Let me stop this. And what we want to end up with is something where we can layer this track, but make some changes so that different tracks, they're all going to share the same sequence, but one of them might be pitched lower, or one of them might play slower, or just on a different tempo. So we're going to add some constructors to this parameter. So let's see what are some of the things we could generalize about a track that we might want to customize every time we create a new track. So the first thing we could put in here as a parameter might be the node duration, right? Maybe you want to be able to change the node duration. So we're going to say this dot node duration. We're going to save the parameter onto our object, right? We're going to create an internal variable. And then when we play a note, we're going to put in this dot node duration. What that allows us to do is now we can go when we create our track, you can say, put in a node duration over here. This could be short, right? Or this could be really long. So now we have the ability to put in different node durations as we create our track. What are some other things we might want to tweak? Well, we have the node duration. We have the interval, right? So let's think of this as our tempo, right? That's going to be the tempo for our pattern. Let's save it as an internal object first. And then over here, we're going to say interval this dot tempo, in case, down the road, we may want to refer to this tempo again. So now we'll have a parameter where we can set a different tempo, and we can give it a default value if we want to, right? So the default might be 1/8 of a note. Maybe the default note duration is also 8 notes. Those are defaults, which means if I don't provide a parameter, right? If I don't add a tempo over here, it's going to give me the default value. But if I provide it, it's going to use the value provided. So that's a useful feature, these default parameters here. Something else we might want to tweak is the pattern arpeggio style, right? Remember, we have all of these different pattern name here, these different arpeggio styles we can use. So the default might be up, but then we could put in different arpeggio styles. So let's put the let's call this pattern type. The default is going to be up, and we're going to put that in here as pattern type. And let's put a little note here for ourselves down the road while we're at it. These are the different pattern types that are possible. So we don't have to keep looking it up all the time. Okay, so different pattern types we can put in. And then the final thing that would be useful to put in is the ability to what happened there? Doesn't like having a comment in here. I've accidentally deleted my open curly bracket. Never mind. So the other thing that could be interesting is we're going to add a parameter that's going to allow us to take the sequence and transpose it. Okay? So we're going to set transpose here, and the default is going to be 0. Don't transpose at all. And what this idea is going to allow us to do is going to be to shift the sequence, right, by a certain number of notes in our scale. So we're going to save the transpose value, the parameter, and we're going to use this here when we map a note. So in addition to grabbing the number from the sequence, right, we're going to add this fixed offset to it, which is going to be our transposition. And when we talk about transposition in music, it just means shifting things up or down, right? And here we're going to transpose within a scale because we're using map notes. So we'll say this dot transpose. And what that's going to allow us to do is create this track, for example, right? If I put in a transposition of 0, it's the same track. If I go -7, it's the same sequence, but now it's being transposed 1 octave down. Or I could go, 7, Now I've transposed 1 octave up, and 7 works, remember, because we have 7 notes in our scale. Or I could just transpose by an arbitrary amount as well. If I transpose by 4, now it's going to start on a G, right? And in terms of the C major scale, those of you who are interested in that, I'm transposing my whole pattern here by what's called an interval of a fifth, okay? Even though it's 4. So now we're going to be able to take the same sequence and modify it, right? Just have it play at different places in the scale. So now we have the ability to transpose, let's say an octave down, change the note duration, quarter notes. We can change the tempo if we want to, and we can change the type of pattern. Cool. All right, so we're going to stop here for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to take this idea of a track we just developed, and we're going to create a layered composition that's going to be taking multiple tracks of the same pattern, but playing it at different octaves, at different speeds at the same time, just to create some interesting, interesting musical ideas. So I'll see you in the next lesson.